The county of Westmoreland, in the early spring of the year of our Lord, 1819, the long, quiet country at the north end of England, between the Pennine Fells and the Cumberland Mountains, the River Eden, running southwest through the green dale bottom from Penrith, past Appleby and on to the border, the small flagged road on the east bank of the river, running through Longmartin and Crackenthorpe, and the steady country pasture between, and the village of Sedbury in the Vale, at the small bridge below Brough Castle. The village itself, 24 houses on a single south-running street between the Chalk Down and the river, the parish church of St Andrew, with its low square Norman tower at the south end, the rectory at the north end, the village green with the small, ancient market cross between, the smiths at the south corner of the green, the small public house the Eden Arms at the north corner, the village shop at the centre. The lane behind St Andrews, running southeast between the south wall of the churchyard and the small kitchen gardens of the village, narrow and grassed at the verge, ending at the small parsonage cottage at the south end, where it joined the footbridge over the small mill stream of the Eden. The curate's cottage at the south end of the lane, a small whitewashed Westmoreland country cottage of 3 rooms below and 2 above, slate roof, 2 light leaded windows north and south, a small kitchen garden of bare March soil at the back, a small front court with 3 bare lilac shoots, the green-painted front door newly mended at the hinge, the small kitchen parlour at the south end of the cottage, pale cream papered walls, a small marble chimney-piece with a low fire of seasoned beech, a small mahogany writing desk by the leaded south window, a brass candlestick burning steady against the cold pale blue morning light, a small white china teacup half drained, an open sheet of cream-laid paper, a steel pen poised. The writing desk in close detail, the sheet bears in steady country hand the half-drafted opening of a letter dated Sedbury in the Vale, Westmoreland, the 28th of March, 1819, to a correspondent at Lincoln's Inn, London, beginning, Sir, I am in receipt of your letter of the 22nd instant, in which your honour is so kind as to inform me of my late great-aunt Mrs. Sybil Greenhall's bequest of the small cottage at Hawkshead, and an annuity of £180 per annum. The young woman at the desk, 23, weight 25, seated upright in steady country composure, the steel pen poised above the 3rd line of the letter, her clear hazel eyes lowered to the page. Mrs. Lydia Greville, née Hartcliffe, small and neat, soft mid-brown hair pinned plain, hazel eyes very steady, in plain dove-grey wool half-mourning, 25, widow of the late Reverend Edwin Greville, country curate of this parish. She had been born at Carlisle, the only child of Mr. Thomas Hartcliffe, the Carlisle bookseller, who had died in 1813, and of Mrs. Selina Hartcliffe, née Marwood, who had been carried off by a chest complaint in 1809. She had married Edwin Greville at Carlisle in the spring of 1815 and had come down to Sedbury in the Vale that Whitsuntide as the new curate's wife. She had been a curate's widow for 1 year and 5 months on this present Sunday morning of the 28th of March, 1819. The late Reverend Greville had been taken from her on the 19th of October, 1817, of a fever caught at the parish bedside of an old shepherd up at the small hill farm above Crackenthorpe in his 29th year. He had been ill 4 days and had died at the small front bedroom of the cottage in the early grey hour before dawn, with Lydia at the bedside. The 18 months and 10 days since had laid themselves down in steady country fashion. The Sedbury living had a standing arrangement upon the death of a curate, settled in the 3rd Duke of Sedbury's time and renewed by the 4th, by which the curate's widow was paid a pension of £20 a year out of the living's small reserved fund, paid quarterly into the Carlisle Bank at the 4 quarter days. £20 a year would have kept a single woman in a hired cottage with little plain food and small candle, and very little else. But the parish had been kinder than its bare-standing arrangement. The Reverend Sidgwick, the parish vicar of Sedbury in the Vale, white-haired and gold-rimmed spectacled, plain black cassock, kind in his slow scholarly country way, had at the late curate's burial said to Lydia plainly that the cottage was hers as long as she had any present use for it. The Reverend Pellerin, who had come down to Sedbury at the beginning of November 1817 as the new curate appointed by the Sedbury living, thin and sandy and Cambridge-educated, plain black country cassock, 29 and kind, had taken his rooms in a small chamber at the rectory itself, and had said to Lydia at his first call that he would not turn the late curate's widow out of the late curate's cottage at any hour she had a present need of it. Lydia had set herself, in those 18 months and 10 days, to add to the £20 a year of the Sedbury pension. She had taken in plain sewing for the village, small chemises, plain caps, shirts mended, the small white linen for the village christenings, at the steady country rate of 1 shilling and 6pence the day's work, and she had taken on the small Latin teaching of the Reverend Sidgwick's 2 younger nephews at the rectory parlour on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, at 7 shillings and 6pence the week. The plain sewing and the Latin teaching between them brought her in £15 a year. With the Sedbury pension, she had £35 a year. £35 a year, in the small whitewashed cottage at the south end of the lane behind St Andrew's, with the kitchen garden and the small front court and the green-painted door, had been her independence. She had paid the parish £2 a year for the small rent of the cottage. She had bought her plain country food and her small ration of beech and Kendal coal. She had kept the 2 plain dove-grey wool dresses of her half-mourning in steady country repair. She had not been in any want of any small thing. She had borne the long, quiet country composure of those 18 months and 10 days with the steady country composure of her late mother's family, the Marwoods of Penrith. She had not wept at the late curate's burial. She had not wept on any subsequent occasion that any party in the village had had any present knowledge of. The arrangement at the cottage had been understood, also, to be by its nature a temporary arrangement. The new curate at 29 would in the steady course of country curacy take a wife, and when the new curate took a wife, the new curate's wife would in the steady course of the same have the cottage. Lydia had understood this from the 3rd day of November 1817, when the Reverend Pellerin had first called upon her. She had taken her £35 a year and her steady country composure with that present understanding. The news had come at the beginning of the present month of March. The Reverend Pellerin had at last, in his 30th year, accepted the hand of Miss Catherine Birkett, the eldest daughter of the Reverend Birkett of a small Lincolnshire parish near Spalding. He had ridden into Lincolnshire at the latter end of February. He had returned to Sedbury at the 2nd week of March engaged, and the wedding was to be at Whitsun, at the bride's father's parish, on the Wednesday before Whitsunday, the 26th of May. The new Mrs. Pellerin would come up to Sedbury in the Vale with the Reverend Pellerin upon the Saturday following, the 29th of May. There would be 6 of them at the cottage by Whitsun, not 2. The Reverend Pellerin had in the early autumn of 1818 taken upon himself the care of the 4 small children of his late elder brother, a small naval lieutenant carried off of a chest complaint at Portsmouth. The 4 small Pellerin nephews and nieces, 2 boys of 8 and 6, and 2 girls of 5 and 3, were to come up to Sedbury at Whitsun with the new Mrs. Pellerin and to live at the cottage as their own. The cottage of 3 rooms below and 2 above would be a full Pellerin house at Whitsun. Lydia must vacate by the last Saturday before Whitsun, Saturday, the 29th of May, 1819, and must remove to whatever steady country lodging she could find at £35 a year clear. She had understood, at the 3rd week of March, that she had 8 Saturdays before Whitsun, and that she had not yet found such a lodging at any price. The letter from Lincoln's Inn had come on the Saturday afternoon coach of the 27th of March, 1819. The Saturday afternoon coach was the small four-horse country mail that ran south from Carlisle through Appleby and Brole and Bowes to Boroughbridge and on to York and London. It came down through Sedbury in the Vale at 5:20 past 4. The small parish mail for the curate's widow at the cottage was carried down the lane by the boy at the Eden Arms. He had knocked at the green-painted door at 4:30. Lydia had taken the letter at the small front court, thanked him, and gone in. The letter had been sealed with a small red wax seal in the form of the letter B, and was directed in a thin, gold-rimmed, spectacled hand to Mrs. Lydia Greville, at the curate's cottage at Sedbury in the Vale, Westmoreland. The seal had been broken at the small mahogany writing desk by the leaded south window at 5:20 before 5. The letter was from Mr. Belton of Lincoln's Inn, London, the family solicitor to the Sedbury living. Mr. Belton begged leave to inform Mrs. Greville that her late great-aunt by her late mother's marriage, Mrs. Sybil Greenhorse, widow of Hawkshead in the parish of Hawkshead in the county of Lancashire, had departed this life at the small Lakeland cottage there at the great age of 81 years on the 22nd of February, 1819, of no particular illness, but of the steady country exhaustion of a long, quiet country age. Mr. Belton begged leave further to inform Mrs. Greville that the late Mrs. Greenhall had at the November of 1818 signed a will in which she had left to her dear great-niece by marriage, Mrs. Lydia Greville, née Hartcliffe of the curate's cottage at Sedbury in the Vale, Westmoreland, the small Lakeland cottage at Hawkshead, in fee simple, together with an annuity of £180 per annum in the 3% funds, the principal sum to be settled likewise upon Mrs. Greville in fee simple, the whole to be paid quarterly into the Carlisle Bank from the present Lady Day of 1819. Mr. Belton had appended a small, steady professional note to the effect that the late Mrs. Greenhall had been the only sister of Mrs. Greville's late mother's eldest sister's husband, Mr. Greenhall of Cockermouth, and that the relationship was therefore at one remove of marriage, that the late Mrs. Greenhall had had no children of her own and no near surviving relation, and that she had, in her long, quiet country age, read with steady country attention the small notice of the late Reverend Edwin Greville's death and burial at Sedbury in the Vale at the latter end of October 1817, and had, at the November following, resolved upon the present bequest. Mr. Belton begged the favour of Mrs. Greville's earliest reply, and was, with steady country respect, her obedient servant. Lydia had read the letter twice, through at the writing desk at 5:20 before 5 of the Saturday afternoon. She had set it down upon the small mahogany. She had sat at the writing desk in steady country composure for the small space of perhaps 4 or 5 minutes, with her clear hazel eyes lowered to the cream-laid paper and her 2 plain hands folded in her dove-grey wool lap. She had not met her late great-aunt, Mrs. Sybil Greenhall. She had not, in 25 years, exchanged any small letter or any small message of any kind with her late great-aunt. She had not, in any present sense, known her. She had, at the small space of perhaps 4 or 5 minutes, risen, gone to the small marble chimney-piece, and laid a single small log of seasoned beech upon the low fire. She had returned to the writing desk. She had taken the steel pen and a clean sheet of cream-laid paper from the small drawer, and had begun her reply. She had not finished it at the Saturday evening. She had laid it aside at 9 o'clock, and gone to her bed at 1:30 in steady country composure, with the half-drafted letter on the writing desk and the brass candlestick out. She had risen at 6 on the Sunday morning of the 28th of March, attended the morning service at St. Andrew's at the regular Sedbury hour of 9, returned to the cottage at 10:15, and sat down at the writing desk to continue her reply. The half-drafted letter on the writing desk now bore in steady country hand the 3 full lines of, "Sir, I am in receipt of your letter of the 22nd instant, in which your honour is so kind as to inform me of my late great-aunt, Mrs. Sybil Greenhall's bequest of the small cottage at Hawkshead, and an annuity of £180 per annum. I beg leave to acknowledge, with steady country gratitude, the late Mrs. Greenhall's kindness in providing for one to whom she had no nearer claim than the steady country claim of marriage at one remove." The 3rd line ran out at the word remove. The steel pen was poised above the cream-laid paper. Lydia, in steady country composure, had decided in the half-hour between the morning service and the present writing what she should do with the bequest. She should not sell the small Lakeland cottage at Hawkshead. She should not lay the £180 a year up at the Carlisle Bank and remain at Sedbury in the Vale upon £35 a year and a hired country lodging. She should go up to Hawkshead at Whitsun, take possession of the small Lakeland cottage herself, and live there at the £180 a year in steady country independence. She should write to Mr. Belton at this present writing to that effect, and to ask his free professional kindness in the small matter of the formal acknowledgement to the Hawkshead solicitor. She should write to the Reverend Sidgwick at the rectory tomorrow morning to give her formal notice of vacation of the curate's cottage at Saturday the 29th of May. She should write to the Reverend Pellerin in Lincolnshire by the same post. She had decided. The steel pen was poised. The 4th line was to begin. The knock at the green-painted front door of the cottage came at 10:30 of the Sunday morning. Lydia laid the steel pen down upon the small mahogany writing desk in steady country composure. She rose from the writing desk, smoothed the dove-grey wool of her plain morning dress, went out of the small kitchen parlour, down the short passage of pale cream-papered wall to the green-painted front door, and opened it. Lord Tristram Calveley, 5th Duke of Sedbury, 34, tall and dark, the firm Calveley jaw and one streak of silver above the left temple, blue-grey eyes that did not look away, in plain country morning dress of dark grey superfine and plain black riding boots, stood at the green-painted door. He had come on foot down the lane behind St. Andrew's from the south porch of the parish church. He had attended the morning service at the regular Sedbury hour of 9, his standing Sunday at St. Andrew's, and had stood at the south porch after the service in steady country conversation with the Reverend Sidgwick and the Reverend Pellerin. The Reverend Pellerin had, in the small quarter hour of the porch conversation, mentioned to him at the porch the small piece of country news that had come down by the Saturday afternoon coach, that the curate's widow at the cottage had been left a small Lakeland cottage and an annuity of £180 by a great-aunt at Hawkshead, whom she had never met. The Duke had thought upon the small piece of country news at the small half-mile walk back along the lane behind St. Andrew's to the south porch. He had then turned aside from his own way at the small footbridge over the mill stream, and had come down the lane to the green-painted front door of the curate's cottage at the south end. "Mrs. Greville," he said, inclining slowly at the green-painted door, "forgive me. I have come at the kind information of the Reverend Pellerin to congratulate you upon your great-aunt's kindness. May I offer you the free professional assistance of Mr. Belton of Lincoln's Inn, Sedbury's family solicitor, in the matter of the bequest? I trust I do not intrude." Lydia inclined at the green-painted door in steady country composure. "Your Grace, you do not intrude. Will you come in?" She showed him into the small kitchen parlour at the south end of the cottage, and to the small chair by the low fire of seasoned beech. He took the small chair. She took the small chair opposite, at the side of the writing desk by the leaded south window. The brass candlestick was burning steady. The half-drafted letter lay on the cream-laid paper at the writing desk. "I shall be very plain, Mrs. Greville," the Duke said quietly, his hands set steady upon his knees. Edwin and I took our degrees together at Cambridge in 1811. We had read for the same little go in 1809. He was the steadiest friend I had at the university. I had been the careless one, and he the careful, and I had had occasion to be grateful for the careful one a great many times. I attended his burial here in October 1817. "You did, Your Grace," Lydia said. "I recall it. You will recall, then, that I did not call upon you at the cottage afterwards. I have not called upon you at the cottage at any subsequent occasion in 18 months and 10 days. You have not, Your Grace. Mrs. Greville, I am 18 months and 10 days late in calling upon Edwin's widow. The fault is entirely mine. I had not, in the year of my own mother's death, of 1815 and the year following, known how to call upon the widow of an old friend at the same hour of my own grieving. I had let the year following that pass at the small, steady cowardice of a man who did not know what to say. I am here now." "Your Grace," Lydia said, after a small, composed silence, "I had not looked for you to call. I do not require any apology. I shall be very glad of Mr. Belton's kindness." The Duke inclined slowly at the small chair by the fire. He spoke of Mr. Belton's particular qualifications in such matters, of the standing arrangement by which Mr. Belton acted free of charge in any small matter that touched the Sedberry living or its present and past officers' households, of his own willingness to write to Mr. Belton at the Sunday Evening Post and to ask him to come up to Sedberry Park on the Monday morning. Lydia listened in steady country composure and accepted, in plain country phrase, his offer. He rose at 11:45. He took her hand at the green-painted door and inclined deeper at the door than he had inclined on entering, and went out down the small front court and back up the lane behind St. Andrew's at the same plain country walking pace at which he had come. Lydia closed the green-painted door, returned down the short passage of pale cream-papered wall to the small kitchen parlour, and sat down at the small mahogany writing desk by the leaded south window. The brass candlestick was burning steady. The half-drafted letter lay at the third line. The steel pen lay across the small mahogany where she had laid it down at 10:30. She had not, in 18 months and 10 days, expected the Duke of Sedberry at the green-painted door of the curate's cottage at 10:30 on a Sunday morning. She had not, in 18 months and 10 days, expected to be inheriting £180 a year clear, with the £8 of the Hawkshead Millers' tenancy and a small Lakeland cottage at Hawkshead in fee simple. She had not, in the early grey hour before dawn of the 19th of October, 1817, at the small front bedroom of the cottage, with the late Reverend Greville at the bed, and the village doctor at the foot, and the Reverend Sidgwick at the chair beside, expected to be on this present Sunday morning of the 28th of March, 1819 at all. She took the steel pen from the small mahogany in steady country composure and began the fourth line of her reply. Monday the 29th of March in the year of our Lord, 1819 at 10 o'clock in the forenoon. The pale sun stood low over the chalk, down at the east of the village. The small mill-stream of the Eden ran clear and quick under the footbridge at the south end of the lane. The lilac in the small front court of the curate's cottage stood in bare March bud, and the green-painted front door, newly mended at the hinge, stood ready to be opened. The knock came at the hour exactly. Lydia opened the door herself, for the small daily girl Nan was at the village shop on the morning errand and admitted Mr. Belton. Mr. Belton, 54, the family solicitor at Sedberry for some 20 years, thin and grey and scholarly, gold-rimmed spectacles set well down the bridge of his nose, plain black superfine country coat with a high-collared white shirt front, a black leather portfolio of papers held square under his left arm. He bowed to her in the small flagged hall and gave her good morning in the steady, quiet country voice she had heard the day before. She brought him through into the small kitchen parlour at the south end of the cottage, where the low fire of seasoned beech burnt steady on the small marble chimney-piece, and where the small mahogany writing desk by the leaded south window had been cleared for the proper papers. She set him at the desk, and herself in the small straight-backed chair across from him, and gave him a cup of plain black tea from the brown earthenware pot. He opened the black leather portfolio and took out the proper papers. The first was the letter of inquiry he had drafted in his own steady hand the previous evening at Sedbury Park, addressed to Mr. Tatlow, the Hawkshead solicitor at his market-place office. The second was the draft of the standing tenancy agreement for the Hawkshead cottage between Mrs. Lydia Greville, née Hartcliffe of Sedbury in the Vale, as landlady, and Mr. Bewley, the village miller of Hawkshead, as tenant at the standing rent of £8 a year, payable to her direct from Lady Day next. The third was the small printed slip from the Carlisle Bank, an instruction to be signed by Lydia, that the quarterly payment of the late Mrs. Greenhall's annuity of £180 per annum in the funds should be paid into Lydia's own account at the Carlisle Bank from Lady Day quarterly, on the 4 standard quarter days of the legal year. Mr. Belton read the 3 papers through to her in his steady, scholarly country voice, pausing at the end of each clause to allow her to put any question she had. She put 2 questions only. The first, whether Mr. Bewley, the standing tenant, would prefer the rent to be paid in May for the half-year then ending, or at Lady Day in advance. And the second, whether the Carlisle Bank charged any quarterly fee on the standing instruction. Mr. Belton answered both. The rent shall be paid in arrear on the 15th of October and the 15th of April, that being Mr. Bewley's standing custom by the agreement of his late landlady, and the Carlisle Bank charged no fee on the standing instruction for an account such as hers. She signed the 3 papers in her steady country hand at the desk by the leaded south window in turn. Mr. Belton blotted each with a small fold of pink blotting paper from the portfolio and stowed each in turn in its proper place. He closed the portfolio and set it square upon the desk. The arrangement was settled. The annuity should come into Carlisle Bank quarterly from Lady Day next, on the 25th of March, the 24th of June, the 29th of September, and the 25th of December. Mr. Bewley, the village miller of Hawkshead, should continue at his £8 a year on the standing tenancy, payable to Lydia direct. The total income net was settled at £188 per annum. She thanked Mr. Belton plainly. He bowed and took his cup of tea, and they sat the short, composed half-hour at the small kitchen-parlour fire, while he gave her, in his steady country voice, the small particulars of the Hawkshead cottage that he had been able to gather from Mr. Tatlow's letter. The 3 rooms below and 2 above, the small slate roof in good repair, the half-acre of garden running down to the small lane behind the cottage, the small range in the kitchen lately mended at Mrs. Greenhall's own, cost the autumn before, the small flagged front court, the 2 small ash trees at the south end of the garden, the small stone wall against the lane at the back. He gave her also the small standing particulars of the late Mrs. Greenhall's household, the small daily girl, Margaret Story, at £6 a year, who had served her late great-aunt the 7 last years, and who would, Mr. Tatlow had written, be glad of a continued place if Lydia should wish it, the small standing account at the village shop at Hawkshead, with Mrs. Home at the small quarterly settlement, the small standing pew in the parish church of Hawkshead at the north end of the south aisle. Lydia received each particular in the steady country way, and gave him at the end a small plain word of thanks. He left at the quarter before 11, and walked back up the lane in the pale March sun toward the park. Tuesday the 30th of March at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The Duke called at the cottage with Mr. Belton, walking down from the park together at the appointed hour. Lydia received them in the small kitchen parlour. The low fire of seasoned beech burnt steady on the chimney-piece. The brass candlestick stood unlit on the desk, and the pale March sun stood low through the leaded south window. They settled her plan at the desk. She should remove from the curate's cottage at Whitsun, Saturday the 29th of May, the last Saturday before Whitsunday, and take possession of the small Lakeland cottage at Hawkshead. The Sedbury Park wagon should remove her 3 boxes the 18 miles over the fells to Hawkshead on that day. Mr. Belton should write to Mr. Tatlow at Hawkshead to give her formal notice of taking possession on the Monday following. The numbers stood plain: £180 a year in the funds, paid quarterly into the Carlisle Bank from Lady Day. £8 a year from Mr. Bewley, the village miller at Hawkshead, paid half-yearly in arrear on the 15th of October and the 15th of April. £188 a year net. Independence. The Duke watched her in his steady, quiet country way across the small desk. He said nothing of his private hope. He spoke only of the practical matter. Mr. Belton's continued professional assistance, free of charge, the standing offer of the Sedbury Park wagon for her removal at Whitsun, the small standing kindness of his sister, Lady Cordelia, who was to come up from Lincolnshire on the 7th of April with Sir Roderick for the March visit, and who would, he was sure, wish to call. He gave her also a small, steady country word on the matter of the small daily girl, Margaret Story at Hawkshead, that he would, if it suited her, write himself to Mr. Tatlow to ask the girl to remain in place at her standing £6 a year against Lydia's coming at Whitsun. Lydia gave him the small plain word of thanks and said the arrangement would suit her well. Mr. Belton made the small note in the portfolio. Lydia received it all in steady composure. She thanked them both at the cottage door at the 4:15, and stood the small composed moment in the bare lilac court, watching them walk back up the lane toward the park in the pale late afternoon light. The first small green leaf bud had broken on the lowest lilac shoot at the south end of the court that afternoon. Wednesday, the 7th of April. Lady Cordelia Stanhope, 37, the Duke's married elder sister, dark hair like her brother's, pinned plain beneath a small straw bonnet, plain country dress of dove-grey poplin, kind hazel eyes that had her brother's steady country look, arrived at Sedbury Park from Lincolnshire with her husband, Sir Roderick Stanhope, 43, stout country gentleman, soft brown hair, plain dark green country coat, a man inclined to country quiet and country horses and the small standing kindnesses of a Lincolnshire squire's life. Friday the 9th of April at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The Duke walked Cordelia and Sir Roderick down the half-mile from the park to the curate's cottage in the lane behind St. Andrew's. The lilac in the small front court had broken its first green leaf shoot in the warm April air. The green-painted front door stood newly mended at the hinge. Lydia received them in the small kitchen parlour, the low fire of seasoned beech burning steady on the chimney-piece, the small mahogany writing desk by the leaded south window cleared for tea. Nan, the small daily girl, brought through the brown earthenware pot of tea, and the 4 plain country cups, and the small plate of buttered tea-cake from the village shop. Cordelia took Lydia's hand at the small flagged hall and held it the short, composed moment. She gave her a kind, quiet greeting and a brief, warm word for the bequest. Sir Roderick bowed in his country, quiet way and gave her good day, and they sat the small, composed 3/4 of an hour at the kitchen parlour fire over the plain country tea and the small Westmoreland talk of the country. Cordelia spoke warmly of the Hawkshead plan and of the steady small independence of 188 a year. She said in her plain country way that she had liked her late brother curate's widow well at the funeral in October 17, though she had then been but briefly introduced, and that she liked her plainly well now. She gave Lydia, in addition, a small quiet word of the small Lincolnshire country of the Stanhope place, near Sleaford, where she and Sir Roderick kept the small standing country house and the small standing country pew, and the small standing country acquaintance of the Lincolnshire fenland gentry, and asked Lydia in steady country composure whether she had ever been south to the fen, to which Lydia gave the small plain answer that she had not been south of Lancaster in her 25 years. Sir Roderick, in his country gentleman's quiet way, gave a small approving nod to his wife and a small approving smile to Lydia across the fire, and said in his Lincolnshire country voice that the fen was a country well worth the seeing of, and that she should some day come down to them at Sleaford for the small country quiet of the place. They left at the 4:15 and walked back up the lane to the park together. The Duke gave Lydia a small composed bow at the cottage door, and a small steady look that did not look away. Mid-April, the Saturday errands began. The Duke had taken to calling at the cottage at 10 on Saturday mornings, to walk Lydia the 400 yards up the village street to the village shop at the centre of the green, where she did her small weekly errands, the half-pound of black tea, the small block of salt, the pound of brown sugar, the small quarter-pound of plain country candles, the small twist of pins and needles for the plain sewing she still took in. He carried her small basket of country errands back down the village street from the shop to the cottage with the small steady country, courtesy of a Sedberry gentleman, the basket in his left hand at his side, his right at his back, in the standing Calverley country way. The village watched in the small steady country way. The smith at the south corner of the green gave a small composed nod from the open door of the smithy. The blacksmith's wife at the village pump gave a small composed dip of the head. The village shop mistress, Mrs. Pickering, counted Lydia's small change in the steady country way and gave the Duke good day at the counter. The village took its small composed measure of the matter without speaking. The Duke spoke little upon the small walk. He gave her the small country particulars of the country he had ridden the day before, the small standing hedges along the south road, the small lane down to the small ford at Hilton, the small Saturday morning lambs in the home meadow, and asked her the small standing question of her week's plain sewing and her small Latin teaching of the rector's 2 sons. She gave him the small steady answers in her plain country voice. He saw her in at the green-painted front door, and bowed at the small low gate of the lilac court, and walked back up the lane to the park in the warm, pale spring sun. 3 Saturday mornings ran in turn, the 10th, the 17th, the 24th of April, in the standing pattern. The pale spring sun stood higher each Saturday over the chalk down at the east of the village. The lilac in the small front court of the cottage broke at last into its first small purple bud on the 22nd of April. The village said nothing of the matter to her face, but said much of it among itself. Mrs. Pickering, at the shop counter, said to Mrs. Hodges, the wheelwright's wife, on the Saturday afternoon of the 17th, that it was a steady country matter, and that the Duke had the look of a man who had set his mind. Mrs. Hodges said the same to Mrs. Wedgwood, the smith's wife, at the village pump. The Reverend Sidgwick, who had taken his small composed measure of the matter from the south porch on the Sunday of the 11th, said nothing of it to any soul. The Reverend Pellerin, who had taken his own small composed measure on the same Sunday, said nothing of it either, but wrote a small steady country line of it in the Saturday letter he sent down on the 17th to Miss Catherine Birkett at Lincolnshire. A small steady country line of plain country approval. Sunday the 18th of April, the morning service at St. Andrew's at 11. The Reverend Sidgwick at the small Norman pulpit in his plain black country cassock, the Reverend Pellerin at the small reading desk below, Lydia in the third pew of the parish side in her plain dove-grey wool, half mourning, a small plain straw bonnet on her steady mid-brown hair, the Duke in the Sedberry family pew at the east end of the south aisle, Cordelia and Sir Roderick beside him. After the service, the Duke met Lydia at the south porch in the steady country way, gave her good morning and his arm, and walked her back along the lane the half-mile to the cottage. Cordelia walked 3 paces behind them in steady country composure, Sir Roderick at her side. The pale April sun stood warm on the lane. The small mill stream of the Eden ran clear and quick at the footbridge, and the village watched in its small, steady country measure. He left her at the cottage door at the 12:15. Cordelia gave Lydia a small, composed kiss on the cheek and a small, steady, quiet word. They walked back up the lane to the park together. Saturday, the 24th of April, Mr. Belton at Sedbury Park for the quarter-day audit of the Sedbury estate. The 4-day standing audit he held with the Duke each Lady Day, Midsummer, Michaelmas, and Christmas in the small estate room at the south end of the park. Lydia at the park for tea at 4 o'clock at the Duke's standing invitation through Lady Cordelia. She walked up the 2 miles from the cottage in the pale late-afternoon sun in her plain dove-grey wool, half-mourning, her small plain straw bonnet on her steady mid-brown hair. Cordelia met her at the long stone steps of the park's south front and brought her through the great hall. Mr. Hardesty, 62, the butler of Sedbury Park, white-haired beneath the standing country dignity of his calling, plain black butler's coat and high-collared white shirt front, 31 years in service at the park since his appointment as second footman under the late 3rd Duke in 1788, received her at the inner door of the hall and bowed in the steady country way. Cordelia brought her through to the small south drawing-room, where the Duke stood at the chimney-piece in steady country composure. Mrs. Pegg, 56, the housekeeper of Sedbury Park, iron-grey hair beneath plain linen cap, plain bombazine, the great ring of household keys at her hip, gave a small composed dip of the head in the doorway as they passed. They took tea, the small composed hour at the south drawing-room fire. Cordelia poured. Sir Roderick spoke of the country. The Duke watched Lydia in the steady, quiet way across the room. She drank her plain black tea and gave her small, composed answers, and looked at the Duke once across the room and looked steady away. Mrs. Pegg returned at the 4:15 with a small silver salver of plain country cake from the still room and gave it on the small mahogany side table with the standing dignity of the 27th year of her keeping of the park. She gave Lydia a small composed dip of the head as she passed and a small steady country look that was not unkind. Mr. Hardesty came in at the south door of the drawing-room at the 4:45 to give the Duke a small standing note from the headkeeper on a matter of the home wood. The Duke gave the small steady answer and dismissed him in the country way. The small standing order of the park held about Lydia in the steady country way. Cordelia walked Lydia out into the great hall at 6 and gave her at the long stone steps of the south front a small composed embrace and a small steady country word. Mr. Hardesty bowed at the inner door. She walked back down the 2 miles to the cottage at 6 in the warm, pale blue April evening light. The pale spring sun set behind the chalk down at the west as she came down the small lane into the village. Sunday, the 25th of April, the morning service at St. Andrew's at 11, the Reverend Sidgwick at the pulpit, the Reverend Pellerin at the reading desk, Lydia in the 3rd pew, the Duke in the family pew. After the service, the Duke met her at the south porch. He gave her good morning and his arm, and walked her back along the lane the half-mile to the cottage in the warm, pale April sun. Cordelia walked 3 paces behind, Sir Roderick at her side. The small mill stream of the Eden ran clear and quick at the footbridge. The lilac in the small front court of the cottage stood in its first small purple bloom. At the cottage door at noon, he turned to her in the steady country way. The April sun stood warm on the green-painted front door, newly mended at the hinge. Cordelia stood 3 paces back at the small low gate of the lilac court in steady country composure. Sir Roderick at her side. The village street stood quiet behind the south wall of the churchyard. He said, in the steady, quiet country voice she had heard at the cottage door on the morning of the 8th and 20th of March. "Mrs. Greville, may I be permitted to ask you a particular question at 3 o'clock on Saturday next at Sedbury Park, with Lady Cordelia present?" Lydia stood the small, composed moment at the cottage door in the warm, pale April sun. The lilac in the small front court stood in its first small purple bloom at her side. The small mill stream of the Eden ran clear and quick beyond the south wall of the churchyard. Cordelia stood 3 paces back at the gate in steady country composure. The village street stood quiet at the north. She lifted her clear hazel eyes to his and gave him the small composed answer in her steady country voice. "Your Grace, you may." He bowed at the cottage door in the steady country way. Cordelia gave her a small composed smile from the gate. Sir Roderick gave a small country nod. They walked back up the lane toward the park together in the warm, pale April sun. Lydia stood the short, composed moment at the green-painted front door watching them go, and then turned and went in. The small kitchen parlour at the south end of the cottage stood quiet. The low fire of seasoned beech had burnt down to its small, steady afternoon ember. The small mahogany writing desk by the leaded south window stood cleared. The brass candlestick stood unlit. The half-drained white china teacup of the morning stood at the desk's edge. She sat the small, composed quarter hour at the desk in steady country silence, her clear hazel eyes lowered to the small, steady ember on the chimney-piece, and gave the small, steady country thought she had to give to the question of Saturday next. Saturday morning, the 1st of May, in the year of our Lord, 1819. The pale spring sun stood high over the chalk down at the east of the village. The hedgerow along the south road into the park stood at last in its full green leaf. The small lambs in the home meadow ran beside the dam at the small standing rail of the south paddock, and the rooks in the great elms above the south carriage drive of Sedbury Park cried in the warm, pale blue Westmoreland morning. At 10:30, the small hired post-chaise from Penrith, and so by stages from London, drew up at the long stone steps of the south front. From it descended Sir Maurice Whitmore, 47, the Duke's London Calverley cousin at one remove through the third Duke's only daughter's husband's sister's line, florid and oily of countenance, a primrose yellow silk waistcoat at his middle, and a small quizzing glass on a black silk ribbon at his neck, plain dark blue London coat, cut for the town, not the country, a small black leather case of papers held square under his left arm. He had heard at White's a fortnight before, over a small glass of port at the south window on the evening of the 17th of April, of the late Mrs. Sybil Greenhall's small Lakeland bequest. The matter had been reported in his hearing by a Mr. Croxton of the Northern Circuit, who had it from a Mr. Tatlow of Kendal, who had it from his Hawkshead office direct. Sir Maurice had marked it the same evening as a matter to be looked into, and had set his Furnival's Inn solicitor, Mr. Snape, to the small standing inquiry the morning following. He had come up by the Thursday night York mail on the 29th, lain Friday at the King's Arms at Penrith, and taken the small hired chaise, the 18 miles south to Sedbury that Saturday morning. He had come to challenge the bequest. He had also a small standing London grievance against the 5th Duke of Sedbury, a small standing matter of a borrowed 300 guineas at the year 1813, which the Duke had, upon Sir Maurice's continued London irregularity, at last declined to renew at the Michaelmas of 1814, and the small standing grievance had stood at his side in the small dark country way these 5 years. He had come to Sedbury Park that May morning with the small standing grievance and the small standing London card, and the small standing London hope of a settlement out of court at 500 guineas. Mr. Hardesty received him at the inner door of the great hall in the standing country dignity of his calling. He took Sir Maurice's small white card upon the small silver salver, and looked at it the short, composed moment in his steady country way. He bowed in the proper degree for a London cousin at one remove, and gave him good morning, and bade him wait the small composed quarter hour in the small east anteroom of the hall, while he carried the small white card through to the Duke in the morning-room. The Duke was at the morning-room writing desk at the south window in his plain dark grey country coat. He read the small white card the short composed moment, and gave Mr. Hardesty the steady country nod. He sent the second footman down the south carriage drive to the small estate room at the south end of the park to fetch Mr. Belton, who was at the standing quarter-day audit of the Sedbury rents in the small office there, with the head bailiff. Mr. Belton came up at the 11:15 with the small black leather portfolio of the standing estate papers, and was set in the morning-room at the small mahogany side desk at the east window. Mr. Hardesty showed Sir Maurice in at 11:05. Sir Maurice gave a small, ornate London bow and a small, ornate London greeting in the steady, oily country voice of a London cousin who had not been at Sedbury Park these 11 years. The Duke gave a small, steady country bow in return, and set him in the small, straight-backed chair at the south window. Mr. Belton sat at the mahogany side desk in his plain black, superfine, gold-rimmed spectacles set well down the bridge of his nose, the small black leather portfolio square upon the desk. Sir Maurice came directly to the matter. He produced from the small black leather case the Furnival's Inn solicitor's letter, 3 pages of crabbed clerk's hand on plain blue London foolscap, signed Aaron Snape, Furnival's Inn, the 28th of April, 1819, and read the small standing opening paragraphs aloud in the oily country voice. The claim was set forth in the standing form that the late Mrs. Sybil Greenhall, who had died at Hawkshead on the 7th of February, 1819, in her 82nd year, had been the sister of the late Mr. Hubert Greenhall, who had married in the year 1788 Lady Eustacia Calveley, only daughter of the 3rd Duke of Sedbury, and that the said Lady Eustacia's male line collateral kindred, being Sir Maurice himself, through his late father Sir Hubert Whitmore, who had been Lady Eustacia's first cousin by the female line of the Whitmore Calveley into marriage, stood next of kin in the Calveley line to the said Mrs. Greenhall's estate, the said Mrs. Greenhall having herself been by the Greenhall-Calveley marriage of 1788 a Calveley-connected woman. The Duke heard him out in steady country composure. Mr. Belton at the side desk made the small steady country notes in his clerk's hand. Sir Maurice laid the 3 pages of the Snape letter upon the small mahogany side desk in front of Mr. Belton, with a small ornate London flourish, and sat back in the chair at the south window with the small smug London air of a man who had played his standing London card. He added in the small ornate London voice, by way of a small ornate London afterthought, that the matter need not, of course, proceed the standing length of a chancery suit, that a small standing settlement out of court might be arranged at a figure not unreasonable to either side, and that he should be glad in his standing London way to discuss the small standing figure with the Duke's solicitor in the proper private form. Mr. Belton at the side desk made no answer beyond the small steady country note in his clerk's hand. The Duke at the south window of the morning-room made no answer at all. The pale blue May noonlight stood warm at the south window, upon the small standing London quizzing-glass at the black silk ribbon at Sir Maurice's neck. Mr. Belton lifted the 3 pages of the Snape letter and read them through twice in his steady scholarly country way at the side desk. He laid them flat. He took from the small black leather portfolio the proper papers he had brought up that morning from his Sedbury Park standing safe. First, the original certificate of the marriage of Lady Eustacia Calveley with Mr. Reginald Yeatman of the Yeatman Lincolnshire Fenland line, solemnised at St. George's, Hanover Square, on the 12th of June, 1788, certifying that the lady had married outside the Calveley name and into the Yeatman line. Second, the original certificate of the marriage of Mr. Hubert Greenhull of Hawkshead with Miss Susanna Yeatman, sister of the said Reginald, solemnised at Hawkshead Parish Church on the 3rd of October 1791, certifying that Mr. Greenhull's wife had been a Yeatman, not a Calveley. 3rd. And this Mr. Belton produced with the small, steady country flourish of a solicitor laying down the winning card, the original will of the late Mrs. Sybil Greenhull. The will had been signed at Hawkshead on the 14th of November, 1818, 3 months before her death. It had been witnessed by Mr. Tatlow, her local solicitor, and by the Reverend Lipscomb, her village vicar at Hawkshead Parish Church. The standing devise stood plain in the small country hand of Mr. Tatlow's clerk. I give and bequeath unto my dear great-niece by marriage, Mrs. Lydia Greville, née Hartcliffe of the Curate's cottage at Sedbury in the Vale, Westmoreland, my freehold cottage at Hawkshead in the parish of Hawkshead, with the half-acre of garden, thereto belonging in fee simple, and my standing annuity of £180 per annum in the 3% consols at the Bank of England, to her and her heirs for ever. Mr. Belton read the standing devise aloud in his steady, scholarly country voice. He laid the will flat on the side desk beside the Snape letter. He gave Sir Maurice the small, steady country look over the gold-rimmed spectacles and said in his plain country way that Sir Maurice had no claim by the will's strict construction, the bequest being to a named legatee, and the legatee being unimpeachably Mrs. Lydia Greville, née Hartcliffe of Sedbury in the Vale. He added in the steady, scholarly country voice, by way of the small, standing professional refutation, that the Calverley male line doctrine, which the Snape letter set forth, had been settled against in the standing English authority of the case of Sutton versus Drake in the year 1779, that the Lady Eustacia Calveley's marriage outside the Calveley name in 1788 had broken the Calveley line at that date for all standing collateral purposes, and that the Greenhull Yeatman marriage of 1791 stood twice removed from any Calveley connection that might have stood before. The Snape letter, said Mr. Belton in the steady country voice, would not pass the small standing eye of a chancery clerk at the first reading, and would not be filed. Sir Maurice rose from the chair at the south window, with a small, ornate London flush at his florid country countenance. He blustered. He spoke of chancery in a small, ornate London voice. He vowed in the standing London bluster that the Snape letter should go down to Chancery the Monday following, that the standing Calveley male line claim should be brought before the Lord Chancellor in due course, that the will should be set aside upon the doctrine of next of kin in the male line. He spoke a small further London word of the small standing influence of his late father Sir Hubert at the Inner Temple, and of the small standing connection of his own line at the Doctors' Commons, and gave the Duke at the morning-room door a small ornate London assurance that the matter should be pressed to the full standing length of the law. He took his small black leather case under the left arm and the Snape letter from the side desk, and gave the Duke a small ornate London bow at the morning-room door. The Duke gave him a small steady country bow in return. He said in his plain country voice that the matter should be heard at Chancery in the proper form if it should so be brought, and that Mr. Belton stood at the Sedbury family's standing service in any such proceeding. He added in the steady country way that no settlement out of court should be considered, that the Sedbury family's standing position upon the matter was that the late Mrs. Greenhull's will stood plain, and that the named legatee should take the bequest unencumbered, and that Sir Maurice should kindly take his leave. Mr. Hardesty saw Sir Maurice out at the south front at the small hired chaise at noon. The chaise drove off down the south carriage drive at the steady country trot toward Penrith and the London road. The Duke stood the small composed moment at the south window of the morning-room, watching the small hired chaise out of sight beyond the elms at the bend of the carriage drive. Mr. Belton at the side desk stowed the proper papers in the small black leather portfolio. The Duke turned to him at last and gave him in the steady country way the small standing instruction that the inquiry into Sir Maurice's London circumstances should commence the Monday following through Mr. Belton's standing Lincoln's Inn agent, and that the conversation he had intended to have with Mrs. Greville that afternoon at 3 o'clock should stand postponed until the threat had been laid to rest. He rode himself down the half-mile to the cottage at the 1:45 in the plain dark grey country coat upon the small steady country mare, and gave Nan, the small daily girl, the standing rein at the small low gate of the lilac court. Lydia received him at the green-painted front door in the steady country way, in her plain dove-grey wool, half-mourning, the small kitchen parlour fire at her back through the open inner door. He stood the small composed moment at the small flagged hall, and gave her in the steady, quiet country voice he had used at the cottage door on the morning of the 8th and 20th of March, and again on the morning of the 5 and 20th of April, the small, steady country word he had come to give. Mrs. Greville, I cannot in honour ask you the question I had intended to ask, while a forged claim hangs over the bequest. I shall ask it when the claim is laid to rest. Lydia stood the small composed moment at the small flagged hall in the steady country way. The pale blue May noon light stood warm through the leaded south window beyond the open inner door of the kitchen parlour. She lifted her clear hazel eyes to his and gave him the small composed answer in her plain country voice. Your Grace, I shall wait. He stood the further small composed moment in the small flagged hall and gave her in the steady country way the small standing particulars of the matter. That a Sir Maurice Whitmore, a London Calvley cousin at one remove, had that morning at the park advanced through his Furnival's Inn solicitor a small standing claim against the late Mrs. Greenhalgh's bequest upon the doctrine of the Calvley male line, that Mr. Belton had on the standing professional reading refuted the claim at first sight as being without foundation by the strict construction of the 3rd Duke's daughter's 1788 marriage outside the Calvley name, that Sir Maurice had nevertheless vowed chancery and had taken the small hired chaise back to Penrith and the London road, and that Mr. Belton should commence the standing inquiry into Sir Maurice's London circumstances the Monday following. He bowed at the small flagged hall in the steady country way. She saw him out at the green-painted front door, and stood the small composed moment at the small low gate of the lilac court, watching him mount the small steady country mare and ride back up the lane to the park. The week that followed, the 3rd of May through the 14th of May, held in the small steady country pattern. Mr. Belton commenced his inquiry into Sir Maurice's London circumstances the Monday following through his standing Lincoln's Inn agent, Mr. Pelby, and through Mr. Pelby's standing city man, Mr. Drysdale, at the small chambers off Cornhill. The small standing letters came up by the daily Penrith post in steady country sequence, Tuesday the 4th from Mr. Pelby at Lincoln's Inn, Friday the 7th from Mr. Drysdale at Cornhill, Tuesday the 11th from Mr. Pelby again, Thursday the 13th from a small standing inquiry agent at Pall Mall. The small standing pattern held in the steady country way. Lydia continued the standing packing of the curate's cottage. She had begun on Monday the 3rd with the small country sewing box at the small kitchen parlour writing desk, and proceeded the Tuesday and Wednesday with the small mahogany book cupboard at the north wall, the late Reverend Greville's plain country library of 170 volumes, his small standing run of Cambridge classics, his small standing run of country sermons, his small standing run of the Bishop Beveridge and the Bishop Andrews and the Dr. Don. She wrapped each in plain brown country paper and stowed each in the proper small deal box at the kitchen floor. She proceeded on the Thursday and Friday with the small standing household linen at the small chest of drawers at the head of the narrow country stair, the 6 plain country sheets, the 4 plain country pillowcases, the small standing run of plain country table linen of her own steady country marking in the small linen thread of her bridal year, the small standing run of the late Reverend Greville's plain country shirts, and his standing run of his plain country bands, which she had washed and pressed in the standing country way these 18 months, and laid by in the small lavender of the country drawer. She paused at the small standing run of the bands. She held the 4 small bands, the short composed moment at the small upper window in the warm, pale spring afternoon light. She folded them in plain brown country paper and laid them in the small deal box with the steady country hand. Cordelia at the park insisted in her plain country way on being read to in the afternoon at 3 by Lydia. The standing arrangement held. Lydia walked up the 2 miles from the cottage at the 2:15 each afternoon and sat the small composed 2 hours at the south drawing-room fire with Cordelia at the small standing reading. Cordelia had chosen Burney's Cecilia. They read the 4 volumes in steady country sequence, the first volume on the Monday and Tuesday afternoons, the second on the Wednesday and Thursday, the third on the Friday and Saturday, and the 4th in the week to come. Lydia read aloud in her plain country voice, Cordelia in the small standing wing chair across the fire with her plain country sewing in her lap. Sir Roderick took the country in the morning and joined them at 5 each afternoon for the standing tea. The Duke sat the small composed half-hour at the south window each afternoon and watched. The small country pattern held the 2 weeks. Mr. Hardesty brought in the standing tea at 5 each afternoon upon the small silver salver. Mrs. Pegg, in her plain bombazine, and the great ring of household keys at her hip, gave a small composed dip of the head at the south drawing-room door each afternoon as she passed. Mrs. Creswick at the kitchen sent up the small standing country plate of buttered tea-cake at 5, the small standing country plate of plain cake at the 1/2 the small standing country pot of country marmalade at the small standing country end. The park ran in the steady country way around Lydia, at the south drawing-room fire as it ran around its standing daughter of the house. Cordelia spoke at the standing tea on the Wednesday the 12th of the small standing matter that was not yet spoken. She said in her plain country way that her brother had set his mind these 3 months past, that she had seen the steady country look in him at the funeral of October 17, and had marked it again at his return to Sedbury at the Michaelmas of 18, and that the small standing London claim of Sir Maurice should be laid to rest, the standing Westmoreland fortnight, following at the steady country reading of Mr. Belton's inquiry. Lydia gave the small composed answer in her plain country voice, and turned the small page of the 3rd volume of Cecilia on her lap, and read on. Friday the 14th of May, at the cottage. Lydia at the small mahogany writing desk in the late spring evening. The pale yellow May sun stood low over the chalk down at the west of the village. The leaded south window stood open the small composed inch upon the warm Westmoreland evening. The lilac in the small front court stood in full purple bloom, and its warm, sweet country scent came up the small flagged hall and through the open inner door of the kitchen parlour to the desk. 3 boxes packed, the small deal box of the late Reverend Greville's library at the north wall of the kitchen parlour, the small deal box of the country sewing, and the small standing household linen at the small flagged hall, the small deal box of her own small standing books from her father's late Carlisle bookshop at the foot of the narrow country stair. The 14th day of waiting. The cottage had not been disturbed by news of Chancery. Mr. Belton's letters had arrived steadily by the daily Penrith post. The Duke had continued his standing daily calls, 10:30 each morning, at the small low gate of the lilac court in the plain dark grey country coat, the small steady country word at the green-painted front door, the small composed quarter hour at the kitchen parlour fire, the small steady country bow at the gate. She sat the small composed half-hour at the small mahogany writing desk in the warm pale yellow May evening light, her clear hazel eyes lowered to the small steady ember on the chimney-piece, and gave the small steady country thought she had to give to the question that had been postponed. The pale yellow May evening light fell warm on the small folded sheet of cream-laid paper at the desk's edge, Mr. Belton's small steady country letter of the Thursday, brought up by the daily Penrith post, and on the small steady country, hand beside it on the polished mahogany top. Mid-May. The standing inquiry of Mr. Belton into Sir Maurice Whitmore's London circumstances, preceded by the daily Penrith Post in the steady country sequence. The small standing letter of Tuesday the 11th from Mr. Pelby at Lincoln's Inn carried up the first composed return, that a small standing search at the Furnival's Inn chambers of Mr. Aaron Snape had been made the Monday previous by Mr. Pelby's standing city man, Mr. Drysdale, and that the small standing books at the chambers stood plain in the steady London way. Mr. Snape had been instructed in the Sir Maurice matter on the 17th of April. Mr. Snape had drawn the standing claim letter on the 22nd. Mr. Snape had taken no fee in advance and would not file at the Six Clerks' Office of the Court of Chancery without one. The standing London terms at Mr. Snape's chambers stood at 50 guineas down upon the filing of a bill and a further 50 upon the answer. The small standing letter of Thursday the 13th from the small standing inquiry agent, Mr. Vyse at Pall Mall, carried up the second composed return, that Sir Maurice Whitmore stood debtor at the small standing London hazard rooms of Mr. Crockford at Pall Mall to the small standing sum of £6,800, that the standing demand had stood at the Lady Day quarter and had not been met, that Mr. Crockford had given Sir Maurice the small standing London grace until the midsummer quarter, and that no further grace should be granted thereafter. The small standing letter set the small standing London figure plain. The small standing letter of Saturday the 15th from Mr. Pelby carried up the third composed return, the standing professional reading upon the Calveley mail line claim. The third Duke of Sedbury's only daughter, Lady Eustacia Calveley, had married Mr. Reginald Yeatman of the Yeatman Lincolnshire Fenland line at St. George's, Hanover Square, on the 12th of June, 1788, by the proper licence in the proper form, and the marriage had stood in the Yeatman name in the Lincolnshire Fenland country these 28 years until her death in the year 1816. The Calveley mail line claim through the said Lady Eustacia stood broken at the date of her marriage in 1788 for all standing collateral purposes by the strict construction of the standing English authority. Mr. Snape's letter of the 22nd of April was on Mr. Pelby's steady professional reading without legal foundation. The small standing letter of Tuesday the 18th from Mr. Drysdale at Cornhill carried up the fourth composed return. A small standing city note that Sir Maurice had on the 17th of May taken further small London accommodation at 12% at the small standing usurer's chambers of Mr. Vandeleur off Chancery Lane against the small standing Whitmore Surrey estate at Reigate, that the said small standing Surrey estate stood already encumbered to the standing limit at the standing mortgage of the late Sir Hubert's day, and that the small standing London position of Sir Maurice should not, in Mr. Drysdale's steady city reading, stand the standing midsummer quarter. Mr. Belton sat the small standing afternoon at the small estate room at the south end of Sedbury Park, with the 4 small standing letters spread upon the small mahogany side desk. He read them through twice in his steady scholarly country way. He gave the small standing scholarly nod at the close of the second reading and laid the 4 letters in the small standing leather portfolio in the proper order. He took up the steel pen. Mr. Belton wrote the formal refutation to Mr. Snape on the morning of Wednesday the 19th of May at the small estate room at the south end of Sedbury Park. He wrote in his steady scholarly country, hand upon plain blue London foolscap of the standing Sedbury family solicitor pattern. The refutation set out the small standing professional grounds in the proper form, the marriage of Lady Eustacia outside the Calverley name in 1788, the Greenhall Yeatman marriage of 1791, twice removed from the Calverley line, the strict construction of the late Mrs. Greenhall's will of the 14th of November 1818, the standing English authority of Sutton v. Drake of 1779. He signed the letter in the steady scholarly country way at the foot of the second page and folded it in the proper third, and sealed it with the small standing Sedbury family solicitor wax. He carried the letter himself down to the village post at the village shop at the centre of the green on the Wednesday afternoon at the 3:15. Mrs. Pickering at the counter took the letter in the steady country way and put it into the small standing Penrith post bag for the 4 o'clock collection. The Duke saw the small standing letter into the post bag from the small standing south corner of the green, where he had stood the small composed moment in the plain dark grey country coat at his small steady country mare's head. The small standing letter went down by the Wednesday evening Penrith mail to York, and so by the Thursday evening York mail to London. It was delivered at Mr. Snape's chambers at Furnival's Inn on the Saturday morning at the 10:15 by the standing general post. Mr. Snape's acknowledgment came up by return of post. The small standing letter, 3 lines only in the small standing London clerk's hand, signed Aaron Snape, Furnival's Inn, the 21st of May, 1819, acknowledged the receipt of Mr. Belton's letter of the 19th, and gave the steady London professional notice that the Sir Maurice Whitmore matter should be discontinued at the said chambers for want of the standing fee in advance. The threat collapsed Friday the 21st of May. Mr. Belton received the small standing acknowledgment at the small estate room at the south end of Sedbury Park at the 4 o'clock Penrith post on the Friday afternoon. He read it through the small composed moment in his steady scholarly country way at the small mahogany side desk and laid it flat. He carried the small standing letter himself across the south paddock to the morning room of the park at the 4:15, and laid it in the steady country way upon the Duke's writing desk at the south window. The Duke read it through twice in steady country composure, and gave the small composed nod. He gave Mr. Belton in the steady country way the small standing instruction that the closed inquiry should be brought up to the morning room the Saturday following at 10 in the proper summary form. Saturday morning, the 22nd of May, at 10 o'clock. The pale yellow late spring sun stood warm over the chalk down at the east of the village. The lilac in the small front court of the cottage stood in its full purple bloom. The hawthorn at the south end of the home meadow stood at last in its first small white country bud. Mr. Belton arrived at Sedbury Park at 10 in his plain black country gig, with the standing pony, the small black leather portfolio of the closed inquiry held square upon the knee. Mr. Hardesty received him at the inner door of the great hall, and brought him through to the morning room at the south window, where the Duke stood in the plain, dark grey country coat. Mr. Belton set the small black leather portfolio upon the small mahogany side desk at the east window. He took from it the standing summary report of the closed inquiry in his steady scholarly country hand, 4 pages of plain blue London foolscap, the 4 standing returns of Pelby and Drysdale, and Vice properly summarised, the standing professional reading, set out at the foot of the 4th page in his steady scholarly country way. The Duke took the report at the small mahogany side desk and read it through twice in steady country composure. He read the first time at the small steady country pace of a man taking the standing facts. He read the second time at the small slower country pace of a man taking the standing meaning. He laid the report flat upon the side desk at the end of the second reading. He gave Mr. Belton in the steady country way the small composed nod. He stood the small composed quarter-minute at the south window in the warm, pale May late morning light. The rooks in the great elms above the south carriage drive cried in the steady country way. The small standing white lambs in the home meadow ran beside the dam at the standing south paddock rail. He spoke at last in the steady, quiet country voice. The matter stood closed. The Snape chambers had discontinued. The Calverley mail line claim stood on the steady professional reading of Mr. Pelby and Mr. Belton both, without legal foundation, by the strict construction of the 3rd Duke's daughter's 1788 marriage outside the Calverley name. The standing bequest of the late Mrs. Sybil Greenhall to Mrs. Lydia Greville, née Hartcliffe of Sedbury in the Vale, stood plain. The Duke gave Mr. Belton at the morning-room door at the 11:15 the small, steady country instruction that the proper settlement deed should be drawn the Monday following. The Hawkshead cottage and the 180 a year in the funds reserved to Lydia's own line outside the Sedbury settlement at the proper construction of the pin money clause, the £8 a year of Mr. Bewley's standing tenancy at Hawkshead reserved to her direct, the proper Sedbury jointure provision settled in the standing country way upon the proper construction of the late Duchess Hyacinth's settlement of 1793. Mr. Belton gave the small composed nod and made the small note. Mr. Hardesty saw Mr. Belton out at the south front, at the small black country gig, at 11 exactly. The Duke rode himself down the half-mile to the cottage at 3 o'clock, in the warm, pale May afternoon, upon the small, steady country mare. He gave Nan the small daily girl, the standing rein at the small low gate of the lilac court. He stood the small composed moment at the green-painted front door in the plain dark grey country coat, his right hand at his back in the standing Calverley country way, the pale yellow May sun warm upon the small mended hinge at his side. Lydia received him in the small kitchen parlour at the south end of the cottage in her plain dove-grey wool half-mourning. The low fire of seasoned beech burnt steady on the small marble chimney-piece. The small mahogany writing-desk by the leaded south window stood cleared. The brass candlestick stood unlit. The small white china teacup of the noon stood at the desk's edge. He stood the small composed moment at the small kitchen parlour fire, and gave her in the steady, quiet country voice he had used at the cottage door on the morning of the 8th and 20th of March, and again on the morning of the 25th of April, and again at the small flagged hall on the noon of the 1st of May, the small steady country word he had come to give. Mrs. Greville, the claim against the bequest has been laid to rest. May I ask the question I had intended to ask on the 1st of May? Lydia stood the small composed moment at the small kitchen parlour fire in the warm, pale May afternoon light. The leaded south window stood the small composed inch open upon the lilac in the front court. The small mill stream of the Eden ran clear and quick at the footbridge beyond the south wall of the churchyard. The pale May sun stood warm on the small marble chimney-piece at her side. She lifted her clear hazel eyes to his, and gave him the small composed answer in her plain country voice. "Your Grace, you may." He stood at the small marble chimney-piece in the plain dark grey country coat in the steady country way. He gave her the small steady country bow he had given her at the cottage door on the morning of the 8th and 20th of March, and stood upright. He said, in his steady, quiet country voice, the standing country frame in the steady country form, that he had not, when he had come up the lane on the Sunday morning of the 8th and 20th of March, expecting only to congratulate her on the bequest of her late great-aunt, expected this Saturday afternoon at the small kitchen parlour fire in the cottage, that he had not before that Sunday morning seen her at the cottage door these 18 months since the funeral of her late husband, though he had known of her at the village from the Reverend Sidgwick's quarterly letter, and had thought of her not infrequently in the steady country way, that when he had seen her at the green-painted front door, newly mended at the hinge on that Sunday morning, he had known in the small composed moment of the recognition that he had loved her steadily since the moment of the recognition, and had been quietly certain of it since. He said in the steady country voice that he had not pressed in the 7 weeks since because she had been a curate's widow of 18 months only, and a small standing Westmoreland country matter required the steady country time. He had walked her to the village shop on her Saturday errands at the small composed walk of the village street. He had walked her back from St. Andrews on the Sundays of the 18th and the 25th of April. He had set Mr. Belton at her professional service for the Greenhall Estate inquiry. He had brought Cordelia to her at the small kitchen parlour fire on the afternoon of the 9th of April. He had stood the small composed 7 weeks at the steady country distance. He said in the steady country voice that the small standing London claim of Sir Maurice had been the small standing accident of the 1st of May, and not the small standing test of the small composed 7 weeks. He had been ready to ask the question at 3 o'clock on the Saturday afternoon of the 1st of May at the small south library of Sedbury Park, with Cordelia in the third wing chair at the south window, and he had postponed in the small standing honour of the matter because no man should ask such a question of a woman while a forged claim hangs upon her bequest. He had stood the further small, composed 3 weeks of the postponement in the steady country way, and had come to the cottage that Saturday afternoon at 3 at the close of the matter to ask the question he had intended to ask at the first. He had not, in those 7 weeks, spoken the small standing private word to her in any quarter, though he had spoken it to Cordelia at the South Library on the evening of the 9th of April, and to Mr. Belton at the small estate room on the morning of the 10th, and to no other soul. He stood the small composed moment at the small marble chimney-piece. He asked her now, in the steady quiet country voice, whether she would do him the steady country honour of being his wife. Lydia stood the small composed moment at the small kitchen parlour fire in the warm, pale May afternoon light. The leaded south window stood the small composed inch open upon the lilac in the front court. The pale May sun stood warm upon the small marble chimney-piece at her side. The small mill stream of the Eden ran clear and quick at the footbridge beyond the south wall of the churchyard. She lifted her clear hazel eyes to his, and gave him, after the small composed silence of perhaps 4 seconds, the small steady country answer in her plain country voice. "Your Grace, I shall." He gave her a small steady country bow at the small marble chimney-piece in the steady country way. He stood the small composed moment in the warm, pale May afternoon light. He took her hand at the small kitchen parlour fire in the steady country way, and held it the short composed half-minute, and gave it back. He bowed at the green-painted front door at the 4:15, and rode back up the lane to the park in the warm, pale yellow May late afternoon sun. That evening at the cottage, Lydia at the small mahogany writing desk by the leaded south window in the warm, pale yellow May evening light. The brass candlestick lit. A small fresh sheet of cream-laid paper. The steel pen poised. She did not weep. She wrote in her steady country hand the 3 plain country letters that the small composed evening required. She wrote first to the Reverend Pellerin and to his bride-to-be, Miss Catherine Birkett, at the Birkett Rectory at Bourne in Lincolnshire. A small, steady country letter of 4 paragraphs, dated Sedbury in the Vale, Westmoreland, the 22nd of May, 1819, addressed to the Reverend Mr. Pellerin and Miss Birkett, the Rectory, Bourne, Lincolnshire, to say that the curate's cottage at the lane behind St. Andrews should be vacated as planned on the Saturday before Whitsun, the 29th of May, but that her removal should be the 2 miles up to Sedbury Park rather than the 18 miles west to Hawkshead. That the small Lakeland cottage at Hawkshead, bequeathed her by her late great-aunt Mrs. Greenhall, should remain hers in fee simple, but should not be her residence, that she should be married at St. Andrews on the Saturday morning of the 26th of June at 10 o'clock to Lord Tristram Calverley, the 5th Duke of Sedbury, by the Reverend Sidgwick, and that the small standing country friendship of the late Reverend Greville's, 18 months past, stood as it had stood. She wrote second to Mr. Belton at his Sedbury Park standing chambers. A small, steady country line of 2 paragraphs, dated the same evening, to bid him draw the proper settlement deed in the standing form upon the Monday morning following, with the Hawkshead cottage and the 180 a year in the funds reserved to her own line outside the Sedbury settlement at the proper construction of the pin-money clause. She wrote third to her father's late shop assistant, Mr. Cuthbertson at Carlisle, who had managed the small standing Hartcliffe bookshop at the Castle Street after her father's death these 6 years past, and who had had the kindness to store her 2 small standing boxes of family books at the small Carlisle warehouse, to bid him send up the 2 boxes by the Penrith carrier in the week following, addressed to Sedbury Park, Sedbury in the Vale, Westmoreland, to the care of Mr. Hardesty, against her removal at Whitsun. She bid him in the small composed last paragraph give her plain country regards to his good wife Mrs. Cuthbertson, and to their 3 small standing daughters at the Carlisle house, and to know that the small standing Hartcliffe bookshop should continue at the standing terms of her father's small standing testamentary disposition, for so long as Mr. Cuthbertson should desire the keeping of it. She added a small further line, that the 2 small standing boxes contained her father's small standing Carlisle copies of the standing English poets in the small calf-bound country editions of the 1790s, the small standing 8 volumes of his Old Caesar, and the small standing 6 volumes of his Old Cicero, and her own small standing girls' books from the small Carlisle nursery of the year 1804. And that the small standing weight of the 2 boxes should be borne upon her own small standing account at the Penrith carrier. She signed each of the 3 letters in her steady country hand at the foot of the last page, Lydia Greville, née Hartcliffe, and sealed each with the small standing country wax. She laid the 3 letters in the small standing letter tray at the desk's corner against the morning collection by Nan for the village shop. The pale yellow May evening light stood low at the leaded south window. The lilac in the small front court stood in its full purple bloom. The small mill stream of the Eden ran clear and quick at the footbridge. The brass candlestick burnt steady on the writing desk at her side. She sat the small composed quarter hour at the desk in the steady country way, her clear hazel eyes lowered to the small steady flame of the brass candlestick, and gave the small steady country thought she had to give to the standing Saturday afternoon of the 22nd of May at the small kitchen parlour fire. The small steady country thought stood plain in her composed country mind. She had given her steady country answer in her plain country voice at the small kitchen parlour fire that afternoon, and the small composed Westmoreland evening at the small mahogany writing desk had stood the steady country completion of the answer in the proper country form. She signed each of the 3 letters in her steady country hand at the foot of the last page, Lydia Greville, née Hartcliffe, and sealed each with the small standing country wax. She laid the 3 letters in the small standing letter tray at the desk's corner against the morning collection by Nan for the village shop. The pale yellow May evening light stood low at the leaded south window. The lilac in the small front court stood in its full purple bloom. The small mill stream of the Eden ran clear and quick at the footbridge. The brass candlestick burnt steady on the writing desk at her side. The Saturday evening of the 22nd of May closed in a slow, steady, pale gold light over the lane behind the south wall of the churchyard, and Lydia, having seen the Duke of Sedbury walk back up the lane towards the village green at a little before 5, sat down at the small mahogany writing desk by the leaded south window of the kitchen parlour, and drew towards her the sheet of cream-laid paper upon which she had begun, 3 days earlier, the small, careful inventory of her possessions in 3 columns, what was to be carried to Sedbury Park in her 3 boxes, what was to be left for Reverend Pellerin and the new Mrs. Pellerin, at the cottage by quiet country arrangement, and what was to be packed separately and sent by the Sedbury Park wagon directly to the small Lakeland cottage at Hawkshead for the housekeeping there when she should come to visit it in the autumn. Sunday, the 23rd of May, she spent at the morning service at St. Andrew's in her usual place in the third pew from the back on the parish side, and then at the cottage in steady packing through the long, pale afternoon. The small linen press at the head of the stairs was emptied, and the plain country linen folded into the larger of her 3 boxes. The small mahogany bookshelf in the kitchen parlour was emptied of the 32 volumes of her late husband's small country library, the Latin Cicero, the Greek New Testament, the 2 volumes of Hooker, the 4 small volumes of Cowper, and packed in steady country care into the smaller of the 2 book boxes. Monday the 24th, Mrs. Pegg drove down from Sedbury Park in the small dog-cart at 10 and spent 2 composed hours at the cottage with Lydia, taking the proper measure of what was to go where, and inclining at the small mahogany writing desk and saying it should come to the South Wing apartments at the park by the Saturday wagon and stand in the small ante-room beside the leaded window there. Mrs. Pegg drove back at noon and left Lydia to her steady country packing. Tuesday, the 25th. Lady Cordelia called at 3, with a small basket of seasoned beech kindling and 2 small jars of Mrs. Creswick's preserved damsons for the cottager's last days, and sat with Lydia at the kitchen parlour fire for an hour, while Lydia drew the cover-cloths over the smaller pieces. Cordelia spoke very little. She inclined when Lydia handed her the small framed silhouette of the late Reverend Edwin Greville from the chimney-piece, and said only, in the small, steady country quiet, "We shall set him on the South Library writing-table, Lydia. Tristram has said so." Wednesday the 26th. Mr. Belton came up from the village inn at 11 with the proper marriage settlement draft, and read it through with Lydia at the kitchen parlour writing desk for a composed hour and a quarter, marking 3 small interlineations in his thin grey lawyer's hand, and saying he should bring the engrossed deed to Sedbury Park on Friday the 11th of June for the proper signing. Thursday the 27th. Lydia walked the half-mile from the cottage to the south porch of St. Andrew's at a little before 9, and stood for 10 composed minutes at the small slate headstone in the southeast corner of the churchyard, the headstone of the late Reverend Edwin Greville, and then walked back to the cottage in the steady country quiet, and finished the packing of the smaller book box. Friday the 28th. The last day at the cottage, Lydia rose at 5 and lit the small kitchen fire, and made the steady country round of the 3 rooms below and the 2 above, settling the last of the cover-cloths, sweeping the flagstones at the front court, mending the green-painted front door at the lower hinge with the small brass screwdriver Mr. Hardesty had sent down from the park, and standing for a composed quarter hour at the writing desk by the leaded south window in the small kitchen parlour, where, on the cold, pale blue Sunday morning of the 28th of March, she had drafted the reply to the Lincoln's Inn solicitor's letter. Saturday, the 29th of May, broke clear and warm and pale gold over the long sweep of the Eden Valley, and the Sedbury Park wagon, drawn by the 2 steady brown geldings the under-coachman Threlkeld brought down at 8:30, drew up at the cottage door at 9 precisely. Mr. Hardesty was upon the box beside Threlkeld in his plain black coat and his white country stock, and he descended in steady country gravity and came up the small flagged path to the green-painted door and took off his hat and inclined and said only, "Mrs. Greville, the wagon is at the door." Lydia inclined in return and stood back from the door and let the 2 under-footmen up from the park, young Tom and young Walter, both in plain country fustian, go in past her to the kitchen parlour and the small back bedroom above, and bring out the 3 boxes one at a time. The larger linen box went first, lifted between the 2 of them in steady country care, and set in the bed of the wagon at the wagon's head. The smaller book box went second, set in beside the linen box. The small writing desk box, with its corner padding of plain blue baize Mrs. Pegg had cut on the Monday, went third, set in at the wagon's tail with 2 small twists of rope at each side. The wagon stood at the door from 9 until a little past 10. Lydia walked through the 3 rooms below and the 2 above one last steady time, drawing the latch-pin to in the small back bedroom and turning the brass key in the green-painted front door at a little past 10, and putting the key in her plain dove-grey wool reticule for the proper handover at noon. At noon precisely, the second of the small Sedbury Park gigs drew up at the cottage door, and Reverend Pellerin and Mrs. Pellerin descended into the small flagged front court, having come up by the Penrith mail from Lincolnshire in 3 days' steady country travel. Lydia stood at the green-painted door with the brass key in her hand and inclined and said, "Mr. Pellerin, Mrs. Pellerin, the cottage is yours from this day. The hinge is mended, the chimney is swept, the back kitchen garden is dug for the early peas, and the small kitchen parlour at the south end is the warmest room in the house." Reverend Pellerin inclined in steady country quiet and took the brass key from her hand and said, "Mrs. Greville, the parish has been the better for you these 18 months. We shall do our best to follow." Mrs. Pellerin, who had inclined warmly at Lydia at the moment of stepping down from the gig, took Lydia's hand for a small, composed instant and said in her steady country voice, "Lydia, we shall mind the headstone." The handover lasted 6 minutes. At 6 minutes past 12, Lydia walked from the cottage door down the small flagged path to the lane and turned south at the lane end and walked the half-mile to the small footbridge over the mill stream and across to the Sedbury Park drive, and Lady Cordelia met her at the south gate with the small dog-cart and drove her the steady 2-mile country drive up the South Avenue to Sedbury Park. The South Wing apartments at the park, a small sitting room and a bedroom and a small ante-room and a dressing room, with 2 leaded south windows giving on to the rose garden, had been made ready by Mrs. Pegg through the week, with the small mahogany writing desk set in the ante-room beside the leaded window, precisely as Mrs. Pegg had said it should stand, and the small framed silhouette of the late Reverend Edwin Greville set on the south library writing table, downstairs precisely as Tristram had said it should be set, and the small brass candlestick from the cottage chimney-piece set on the chimney-piece of the south wing sitting-room, beside the small jar of Mrs. Creswick's preserved damsons Lady Cordelia had brought down on the Tuesday. Sunday the 30th of May. Whitsun broke clear and warm at Sedbury Park, and Lydia rose at 7:30 and dressed in steady country plainness in her dove-grey wool, half-mourning for the late Reverend Edwin Greville, 18 months and 11 days behind her now, and went down to the South Library at 8 for the proper Sunday breakfast with Tristram and Cordelia and Sir Roderick, the 4 of them at the small round mahogany table by the leaded south window in steady country quiet. At 9:15, the small Sedbury Park carriage drew up at the south porch of St. Andrew's, and the 4 of them walked through the south porch and up the centre aisle in steady country composure. And Tristram, with the small composed gravity of the head of the parish living, set his hand to the small brass latch of the family pew at the chancel step on the south side, and held the pew door open for Lydia, and Lydia, after a small composed instant in which the matter of the family pew was quietly settled between them by his steady look and her steady acceptance, stepped into the family pew and sat down beside Cordelia on the south side, Tristram on her other side, Sir Roderick on Cordelia's other side, the 4 of them in steady country quiet. Reverend Pellerin and Mrs. Pellerin sat in the front pew of the parish side opposite. The parish itself filled the back pews in its usual steady country numbers. Reverend Sidgwick took the morning service through with the small composed gravity proper to a Whitsun morning at a country parish, and at the close of the second collect, in the small steady country quiet of the chancel step, he opened the small bound register of banns at the proper page and read in his plain country voice, "I publish the banns of marriage between Lord Tristram Calvley, 5th Duke of Sedbury, of this parish, and Mrs. Lydia Greville, née Hartcliffe, widow, also of this parish. This is the first time of asking, if any of you know cause or just impediment, why these two persons should not be joined together in holy matrimony, ye are to declare it. The parish heard the banns through in steady country composure. The schoolmaster's wife in the 4th pew from the back inclined. The small composed quiet of the church held through the close of the form. Reverend Pellerin in the front pew of the parish side inclined. Mrs. Pellerin inclined beside him, side. The morning service closed in the proper country way, and the family walked from the south porch back to the carriage at a little past 11, and Lydia, walking beside Tristram down the small flagged path of the churchyard, said only in the small steady country quiet between them, "Your Grace, the parish has heard us." The week following, on Monday the 31st of May, through Friday the 4th of June, Lydia settled at Sedbury Park in steady country quiet. Mrs. Pegg gave her the proper tour of the housekeeping arrangements on the Monday morning at 10, the small still room at the north end of the kitchen corridor, the linen room above the south kitchen, the seasoned beech wood store at the back of the south stable, the small slate dairy beyond the east kitchen garden, the standing accounts with the Penrith butcher and the Appleby baker and the small Sedbury village shop, and walked Lydia through the proper Sedbury Park book of weekly orders and showed her the steady country pages of the house book, where each Saturday evening the week's expenditure was set in Mrs. Pegg's plain country hand. Mr. Hardesty managed the south wing service in steady country composure through the week. Young Tom was set to the south wing fires at 6 each morning. The small bedroom maid, Nellie, was set to the south wing dressing room at 6:30. The breakfast tray was sent up to the south wing sitting room at 7:30 on the 3 days Lydia chose to take it in her own apartments, and Lydia came down to the south library at 8 on the 4 days she chose to take it with the family. Mr. Hardesty inclined at each small daily settling of the arrangement, and said only, on the Friday at 7:30, "Mrs. Greville, the south wing is in order." Tuesday, the 1st of June, at 3:30 in the south library, Lady Cordelia drew the small wing chair across the hearthrug to Lydia's side, and took up her plain country sewing, a small white linen napkin for the wedding breakfast at the end of June, and said in her steady country quiet, "Lydia, I have been 37 years a Calverley, and 12 years a Stanhope, and I shall give you the small composed advice my mother Lady Hyacinth gave me on the Tuesday before my own wedding in the South Library at this same hour." Lydia inclined and set down her own sewing, a small plain country hem on the dove-grey wool she was at last permitting Mrs. Pegg to lay aside for her. And Cordelia, in her steady country voice, "The first thing is that the Calverley men are quiet men. My brother Tristram is the quietest of them. He will not say what he feels until he has measured it through. You shall learn to read the small composed silences. The second thing is that the house book at Sedbury Park has been kept by a Calverley wife in steady country composure since 1641, and Mrs. Pegg has shown you the page. The third thing is that the south wing apartments are yours from this day, and the south library is yours from the day of the wedding, and the family pew at St. Andrew's is yours from Sunday last." Cordelia paused. The small fire in the south library hearth held steady. Lydia inclined. Cordelia in the small steady country quiet. "The fourth thing, Lydia, is that my brother has loved you 18 months and 10 days, since the day of the late Reverend Greville's funeral. He did not call upon you in the 18 months for fear of disturbing the half-mourning. He has said so to me in plain words at the South Library hearth this April. He shall be the steadiest country husband in Westmoreland." Lydia inclined in steady country composure. She did not speak for a small composed instant. Then she said only in her steady country voice, "Lady Cordelia, I shall mind it." Sunday the 6th of June broke clear and warm at Sedbury Park, and the four of them drove down the South Avenue to St. Andrews at 9 and walked the South Porch and up the centre aisle in steady country composure and sat in the family pew at the chancel step on the south side, Reverend Pellerin and Mrs. Pellerin in the front pew of the parish side opposite, the parish itself in the back pews in its usual numbers, the schoolmaster's wife in the fourth pew from the back. Reverend Sidgwick, at the close of the second collect, opened the small bound register of banns at the proper page and read in his plain country voice, "I publish the banns of marriage between Lord Tristram Culvley, 5th Duke of Sedbury, of this parish, and Mrs. Lydia Greville, née Hartcliffe, widow, also of this parish. This is the second time of asking. If any of you know cause, or just impediment, why these two persons should not be joined together in holy matrimony, ye are to declare it." The parish heard the banns through in steady country composure. The schoolmaster's wife inclined. The small composed quiet of the church held through the close of the form. Friday the 11th of June at 10:30, Mr. Belton came up the South Avenue in his small hired Penrith gig, with his thin leather portfolio and the engrossed marriage settlement deed on his knee, and was shown into the South Library by Mr. Hardesty in steady country composure, and laid the deed out on the South Library writing table for the proper signing. The deed had been drawn, through Mr. Belton's steady country care over the fortnight previous, and read in his plain Lincoln's Inn hand the proper settlement of the Hawkshead cottage on Lydia's own line, on the late Mrs. Selina Hartcliffe, née Marwood's line, that is, in trust for any future daughter of the present marriage at her majority of 21, and the £180 a year, settled as Lydia's own pin money outside the Sedbury entail, payable to her direct from the funds quarterly at Lady Day and Midsummer, and Michaelmas and Christmas at the Carlisle Bank. Tristram signed in his own steady country hand at the South Library writing table at 11:15, the firm, plain country signature of Tristram Culvley, without his ducal style, in the country manner. Lydia signed beside him in her own steady country hand, Lydia Greville, née Hartcliffe, in plain country composure. Mr. Belton witnessed below in his thin grey lawyer's hand. Sir Roderick, called in from the morning room at 11:05, witnessed below Mr. Belton. Mr. Hardesty, called in from the South Corridor at 11:03, witnessed below Sir Roderick in his plain country butler's hand of 31 years' steady country service. The deed was folded into Mr. Belton's leather portfolio at 11:12 and laid in the small iron-strong box at the south end of the South Library at 11:15, and the small brass key turned in the strong box lock by Tristram in steady country composure, and the small brass key handed to Lydia at the South Library writing table at 11:17. Lydia inclined and set the small brass key in her plain dove-grey wool reticule, and said only, in the steady country quiet between them, "Your Grace, I shall mind it." Sunday the 13th of June broke clear and warm and pale gold over the long sweep of the Eden Valley, and the four of them drove down the South Avenue to St. Andrews at 9 and walked the South Porch and up the centre aisle in steady country composure, and sat in the family pew at the chancel step on the south side, Reverend Pellerin and Mrs. Pellerin in the front pew of the parish side opposite, the parish itself in the back pews in its usual steady country numbers, the schoolmaster's wife in the fourth pew from the back, the small composed quiet of a Westmoreland country parish church on a warm, pale gold Sunday morning in the second week of June, the third Sunday of the form, held through the opening collects in steady country composure. Reverend Sidgwick, at the close of the second collect, closed his small bound book of the morning service at the proper page, and stepped down from the reading desk to the chancel step, and stood at the chancel step with the small bound register of banns in his hand, at the proper open page, and the small composed gravity of the close of the form was upon him in steady country quiet. The parish heard the small, steady country indrawing of breath that goes with the third Sunday. Reverend Sidgwick read in his plain country voice, steadier than on the first Sunday and steadier than on the second. I publish the banns of marriage between Lord Tristram Calveley, 5th Duke of Sedbury, of this parish, and Mrs. Lydia Greville, née Hartcliffe, widow, also of this parish. This is the third time of asking, if any of you know cause or just impediment, why these two persons should not be joined together in holy matrimony, ye are to declare it. Reverend Sidgwick paused at the close of the form in the small composed country quiet of the chancel step. The parish heard it through in the steady country quiet that goes with the third Sunday. No man spoke. No woman spoke. The schoolmaster's wife in the fourth pew from the back inclined. Reverend Pellerin in the front pew of the parish side inclined. Mrs. Pellerin inclined beside him. The small bound register of banns was closed by Reverend Sidgwick at the chancel step in steady country composure at 10:15, and the morning service was taken on through the third collect in the proper country way. The four of them walked from the south porch back to the carriage at 11:15, and Lydia, walking beside Tristram down the small flagged path of the churchyard, said only in the small, steady country quiet between them, "Your Grace, the parish has heard us through the third Sunday." Tristram inclined and said only, "Mrs. Greville, the Saturday is 13 days hence." Lydia inclined in steady country composure. The pale gold morning light held over the long sweep of the Eden Valley as the carriage drew away from the south porch of St. Andrew's and turned up the south avenue of Sedbury Park, and the small composed quiet of a country Sunday morning in the second week of June, the third Sunday of the form, heard through and the interval of 13 days laid open before the Saturday, settled over the South Library and the South Wing apartments at the steady country house in the steady country quiet that had held over the long sweep of the Eden Valley since the cold pale blue Sunday morning of the 28th of March. Saturday morning, the 26th of June, broke clear and warm and pale gold over the long sweep of the Eden Valley, and at a little before 9, the small Sedbury Park carriage stood at the south porch of the steady country house, with the two steady brown geldings in the proper country traces and the under-coachman Threlkeld upon the box in his plain country dark blue livery in steady country composure. And at 9:15, the household at Sedbury Park gathered in the South Library for the small composed country quiet that goes with the half-hour before a country wedding. Mrs. Pegg in her plain bombazine, with her iron-grey hair beneath her plain linen cap and her steady country keys at her hip, stood at the South Library door at 9:20 in steady country composure. Mr. Hardesty, in his plain black butler's coat, with his steady white country stock, stood at the south porch in steady country composure. Mrs. Creswick had set the small, composed country breakfast in the south breakfast room at 7:30, and had returned to the south kitchen at 8:20 for the steady country forenoon at the wedding breakfast preparations. Lydia came down the south staircase at 10:20 in her wedding gown, a plain pale dove silk of country make, made up by the small Penrith dressmaker Mrs. Hoyle through the fortnight previous, with a small pale cream lace at the close country collar, and a small pale cream lace at the close country cuffs, and no other trimming, in the proper steady country way of a 25-year-old country curate's widow at her second marriage. Mr. Belton stood at the foot of the south staircase in his plain black superfine and his gold-rimmed spectacles, with the small composed gravity of a 54-year-old Lincoln's Inn solicitor of 29 years' standing in the Sedbury family, and he inclined as Lydia came down the last 3 steps and offered her his arm in steady country composure, and Lydia took his arm in steady country composure, and the two of them walked through the south corridor and out at the south porch to the carriage at 9:45. Tristram and Sir Roderick had walked down from the south porch to the south avenue at 9:30 and gone on by the south gate to the south porch of St. Andrew's by the footpath through the home meadow, and stood at the chancel step at 9:05 with Reverend Sidgwick in his plain black cassock and his white country surplice. Lady Cordelia rode with Lydia and Mr. Belton in the carriage at 10:10 and went up the centre aisle at 10:05 and stood at the chancel step on the parish side. The parish church of St. Andrew's, Sedbury in the Vale, in the county of Westmoreland, its low square Norman tower at the south end, and its small east window of plain leaded glass, and its small flagged centre aisle running clear from the south porch to the chancel step, held the steady country quiet of a country Saturday morning in the 4th week of June in the year of our Lord 1819 in the proper Westmoreland way. The carriage drew up at the south porch at 10:10, and Mr. Belton handed Lydia down at the south porch in steady country composure, and the two of them walked through the south porch and up the small flagged centre aisle to the chancel step in the steady country quiet of the parish, with the parish in the back pews in its usual numbers, and Reverend Pellerin and Mrs. Pellerin in the front pew of the parish side, and the schoolmaster's wife in the 4th pew from the back, inclining as Lydia passed. Reverend Sidgwick took the marriage service through in his plain country voice, with the small composed gravity proper to a country Saturday morning. Mr. Belton gave the bride away at the proper place, in the form in steady country composure, and stood back to the pew at the parish side at the proper place. Cordelia stood at Lydia's left, in steady country, quiet in her plain country dark blue silk. Sir Roderick stood at Tristram's right, in steady country quiet, in his plain dark green country coat. Tristram set the small plain country gold band on Lydia's hand at the proper place in the form in steady country composure, and Lydia inclined in steady country composure, and Reverend Sidgwick at the close of the form pronounced them man and wife in the proper country way at 10:15. The small composed country quiet of the parish held through the close of the form. The schoolmaster's wife in the 4th pew, from the back inclined. Reverend Pellerin in the front pew of the parish side inclined. Mrs. Pellerin, née Burkett, inclined beside him. The proper signing of the parish register followed at the small flagged vestry at 10:20, Tristram in his steady country hand, Lydia in her steady country hand, Mr. Belton as witness in his thin grey lawyer's hand, Cordelia as witness in her plain country hand. Reverend Sidgwick closed the parish register at the proper page at 10:20 in steady country composure, and the small wedding party walked from the south porch of St. Andrew's down the small flagged path to the lane, and the carriage at 10:30 precisely. The wedding breakfast at Sedbury Park was set in the south dining room at 11:30, with the small composed country plainness proper to the steady country house. Mrs. Creswick, 54, soft grey-brown hair beneath linen cap, warm pale eyes, plain blue print cotton with apron, had been at the south kitchen since 5 with her 3 undermaids, and had set the small proper Westmoreland country wedding breakfast in steady country care. A cold gammon at the head of the table, a cold roast capon at the foot, a small pale yellow cream cheese from the home dairy at the centre, the proper plain country bread from the Appleby baker, a small dish of preserved damsons from the Tuesday before, a small dish of early strawberries from the south kitchen garden, and a small plain country wedding cake of 3 pale layers iced in plain country white at the south sideboard. Sir Roderick, at the head of the table at 12, rose with his small country glass of plain Westmoreland country ale, and gave the proper country toast in his plain country voice. To my brother Tristram, 5th Duke of Sedbury, and to my sister Lydia, the 5th Duchess of Sedbury. The steady country house has its mistress. The small country company at the table inclined in steady country composure. Mr. Belton at the foot of the table rose with his small glass and gave the proper brief lawyer's blessing in his thin grey lawyer's voice. To the steady country house at Sedbury Park, and to the steady country marriage now joined therein, in plain country composure and proper country settlement. The small country company inclined. Lady Cordelia, at the south side of the table, inclined and gave the proper sister's grace in her steady country voice. To Lydia, my sister, and to Tristram, my brother, in the steady country quiet that holds at Sedbury Park. Reverend Pellerin, at the parish side of the table, inclined in steady country composure and said only, to the steady country parish of Sedbury in the Vale, and to the small composed country quiet that holds upon it on this warm pale gold Saturday morning of the 4th week of June. Mrs. Pellerin inclined beside him in steady country composure. Reverend Sidgwick at the north side of the table inclined and said only in his plain country voice, Amen, in the steady country way. The afternoon was warm and pale gold over the south rose garden of Sedbury Park, and at a little past 3, Lydia and Tristram walked from the south porch down the small flagged path to the south rose garden in steady country composure, and walked the small flagged round of the south rose garden through the long pale gold afternoon in the small steady country quiet between them. The June roses of the south rose garden, the small pale pink country roses at the south wall, and the small pale cream country roses at the east wall, and the small dark red country roses at the small flagged centre walk, held in the warm pale gold light. The small steady country quiet held between them. They walked the south round twice, and the east round once, and stood at the small stone seat at the south wall for a composed quarter-hour in the small country quiet, and Tristram said only, in the steady country quiet between them, Mrs. Colvley, the south rose garden is yours from this day. Lydia inclined in steady country composure, and said only, Your Grace, I shall mind it. At a little past 5, they walked back to the south porch and went in by the south corridor to the south library. And Mr. Hardesty, in steady country composure, had brought the Calvley family Bible, the large folio bound in plain Westmoreland calf, with the small brass clasps at the south edge, and the small steady country provenance of the Calvley line set in the proper page of the front paste at the steady country hand of the first Duke of Sedbury in the year 1641. Down from the small north library cabinet to the south library writing table, and laid it open at the proper page of marriages between the leaded south window and the small green-shaded reading lamp at 4:30, and set the small steel pen and the small pewter inkstand and the small fine country blotting paper at the proper place at the south library writing table in steady country composure. Tristram sat down at the south library writing table at 5:15, and took up the small steel pen and wrote the marriage entry in his own steady country hand on the proper page of marriages in the Calverley family Bible. On Saturday the 26th of June, in the year of our Lord, 1819, at St. Andrew's Parish Church at Sedbury in the Vale, in the county of Westmoreland, by the Reverend Sidgwick, were married Lord Tristram Calvley, 5th Duke of Sedbury, and Mrs. Lydia Greville, née Hartcliffe, widow of the late Reverend Edwin Greville. He set the small steel pen down at 20 minutes past 5 and inclined to Lydia. Lydia inclined in steady country composure. The small, carefully copied transcript of the late Reverend Edwin Greville's burial entry of the 22nd of October, 1817, which Lydia had asked be set on the proper page of burials at the wedding, was set in below the late Lady Hyacinth's entry of the 15th of June, 1815, by Tristram's own steady country hand at 5:30, in plain country fashion, the husband of the past and the father of the present, standing together on the page in steady country quiet, the small steady country transcript, reading in Tristram's plain country hand, buried at St. Andrew's, Sedbury in the Vale, on Thursday the 22nd of October 1817, in his 29th year, the Reverend Edwin Greville, country curate of this parish, taken of a fever caught at the parish bedside, in steady country composure. 1 year and 5 days after the wedding, on the warm, pale yellow Saturday morning of the 1st of July, 1820, their first child, a son, christened Edwin Tristram Calverley, after his mother's late husband, the Reverend Edwin Greville, and his own father, the present Duke of Sedbury, was baptized at St. Andrew's Parish Church at Sedbury in the Vale, in the county of Westmoreland, by the Reverend Sidgwick, with Lady Cordelia Stanhope standing as godmother and Sir Roderick Stanhope as godfather. The Calverley family Bible entry was written in the 5th Duke of Sedbury's own hand at the South Library writing table that evening, beside the entry for his late mother, the Dowager Lady Hyacinth of June 15th, and the small careful transcript of the late Reverend Edwin Greville's burial entry of October 17, that his widow had asked be set there in plain country fashion at the wedding of the previous June, the husband of the past and the father of the present, standing together on the page in steady country quiet. Reverend Sidgwick had taken the baptism through in his plain country voice at 10:30 on the warm, pale yellow Saturday morning of the 1st of July, with the parish in the back pews in its steady country numbers, and Reverend Pellerin and Mrs. Pellerin in the front pew of the parish side, and the schoolmaster's wife in the 4th pew from the back, inclining as the small white linen christening shawl was set back at the proper place in the form. Lady Cordelia stood at the font on the south side in steady country composure. Sir Roderick stood at the font on the north side in steady country composure. Lydia stood at the chancel step in steady country composure, with the small, steady country quiet of a young Westmoreland mother in her 26th year at the baptism of her firstborn son. Tristram stood at her left in steady country composure. The infant Edwin slept through the proper place in the form, and woke at the small, steady country touch of the warm font water on his small forehead at 12 minutes past 10, and slept again at the close of the form at 11:15. The small, composed country quiet of the parish held through the close of the form. The Calverley family Bible was brought down from the small North Library cabinet to the South Library writing table by Mr. Hardesty at 8:30 that evening at Sedbury Park, and laid open at the proper page of baptisms between the leaded south window and the small green-shaded reading lamp in steady country composure, and Tristram sat down at the South Library writing table at 9:25 to 9, and took up the small steel pen and wrote the baptism entry in his own steady country hand on the proper page of baptisms. On Saturday, the 1st of July in the year of our Lord, 1820, at St. Andrew's Parish Church at Sedbury in the Vale, in the county of Westmoreland, by the Reverend Sidgwick, was baptized Edwin Tristram Calverley, son of Lord Tristram Calverley, 5th Duke of Sedbury, and Lydia Duchess of Sedbury, née Hartcliffe, formerly Greville, with Lady Cordelia Stanhope, godmother, and Sir Roderick Stanhope, godfather. He set the small steel pen down at 10 minutes to 9, and inclined to Lydia, who stood at his left in steady country composure. Lydia inclined in steady country composure, and laid her hand upon the small entry on the page for a small composed instant in steady country quiet. Tuesday the 27th of October, in the year of our Lord, 1820, at 8:30 in the evening, in the South Library at Sedbury Park, the single trimmed lamp on the small mahogany side table burned steady against the cold, pale grey country dark beyond the leaded south window, and the small fire of seasoned beech in the South Library hearth held steady in the steady country, quiet of the long autumn evening, and the 2 wing chairs at the South Library hearth had been drawn close by Mr. Hardesty at 7:30 in steady country composure, with the small country footstool set at the south wing chair at the proper place, and the small folded country shawl of plain pale grey wool set on the south wing chair arm at the proper place in steady country composure. Lydia sat in the south wing chair in plain country pale grey wool, with the small green-bound first volume of Persuasion open on her knee, the small first edition of the previous December that Tristram had brought up from Penrith in the September, and read aloud in her steady country voice from the 7th chapter. The small composed country pace of her reading holding steady against the steady country quiet of the South Library. Tristram sat in the north wing chair opposite, his blue-grey eyes on Lydia in steady country composure, the small steady country quiet of a married man of 1 year and 4 months, and one day holding upon him in the steady country quiet of the South Library hearth. The infant Edwin slept upstairs in the small south nursery beside the south wing apartments, the small steady country breath of him holding in the small composed country quiet of the warm nursery at the south end of the upper corridor, the small white linen cot cover settled by the night nurse Mrs. Tyndale at the proper place at 8 precisely. The small composed quiet of a Westmoreland country evening in the 4th week of October in the year of our Lord, 1820, held over the South Library at Sedbury Park, and the small steady country reading held on through the 7th chapter and into the 8th in steady country composure. At 9:15, Lydia closed the small green-bound first volume of Persuasion at the 7th page of the 8th chapter, and set the small book on the small mahogany side table beside the single trimmed lamp, and Tristram inclined in steady country composure, and said only, in the small steady country quiet between them, "Mrs. Calveley, the hour is at 9:15. The small south nursery is at the south end of the upper corridor. The small night nurse, Mrs. Tyndale, is at her steady country post. The small composed country quiet of the steady country house holds." Lydia inclined in steady country composure, and said only, "Your Grace, I shall mind it." The small fire of seasoned beech in the South Library hearth held steady in the steady country quiet. The single trimmed lamp burned steady against the cold pale grey country dark beyond the leaded south window. The small steady country quiet of a Westmoreland country evening in the 4th week of October held over the South Library at Sedbury Park in the proper steady country way. There are stories that begin with a kiss in the small pale candlelight of a London ballroom, and there are stories that begin with a vow at the chancel step of a Mayfair town church, and there are stories that begin with a glance across a Bath assembly room, or the small composed exchange of a card in a Brighton circulating library, or the chance meeting of a Cumberland riding party at the small inn on the Penrith Road. And there are, quietest of all, in the small, cold, pale blue morning of a Westmoreland country village under the long sweep of the Eden Valley, stories that begin with the slow descent of the morning light from the chalk down through the river and the village and the lane and the cottage and the kitchen parlour to the writing desk by the leaded south window, where a 25-year-old country curate's widow sat upon the cold, pale blue Sunday morning of the 28th of March, 1819. Drafting in steady country, hand the reply to a Lincoln's Inn solicitor's letter that had brought her news of a great-aunt's bequest she had not known existed, and that closed, 18 months and 29 days later, on the small, composed Tuesday evening of the 27th of October, 1820, in the steady country quiet of the South Library at Sedbury Park, with the single trimmed lamp burning steady against the cold, pale grey country dark, and the small fire of seasoned beech holding steady in the South Library hearth, and the 2 wing chairs drawn close at the hearth, and the small green-bound first volume of Persuasion open on her knee, and her steady country voice holding through the 8th chapter, and the small composed country quiet of a 25-year-old country curate's widow, now in her 26th year, as the 5th Duchess of Sedbury, holding upon her in the steady country quiet of the long autumn evening. Mrs. Lydia Greville, née Hartcliffe, 25, widow of the late Reverend Edwin Greville, country curate of Sedbury in the Vale, who had been taken from her of a fever caught at the parish bedside of an old shepherd on the 19th of October, 1817, in his 29th year, sitting at the small mahogany writing desk by the leaded south window in the small kitchen parlour at the south end of the small whitewashed Westmoreland country curate's cottage in the lane behind the south wall of the churchyard at St Andrew's, Sedbury in the Vale, at 10:30 on the cold, pale blue Sunday morning of the 28th of March, 1819, with her steel pen poised above the third line of her steady country reply to a Lincoln's Inn solicitor's letter of the 22nd instant, heard the small steady country knock at the green-painted front door of the cottage, and rose from the writing desk in steady country composure, and walked the small flagged passage from the kitchen parlour to the front door, and turned the small brass key, and drew the green-painted door back upon its newly mended hinge, and stood at the cottage threshold in her plain dove-grey wool in steady country composure, and saw at the threshold, in the cold, pale blue Sunday morning light, the 34-year-old 5th Duke of Sedbury. Tall, dark, the firm Calverley jaw, the one streak of silver above the left temple, the steady blue-grey eyes, her late husband's old Cambridge friend of more than 10 years' standing, calling upon her at the cottage door 18 months and 10 days late, in the small composed country quiet of a Westmoreland country Sunday morning, and became, by his patient steady country, asking through the spring and the early summer of that year, the 5th Duchess of Sedbury.